Weeds are great travelers. They're indeed the tramps of the agricultural world. They walk, they fly, they swim, they steal a ride. They travel by rail, by flood, by wind. They go underground and they go above, across lots and by highways. But, like other tramps, they find it safest by the highway. In the fields, they are intercepted and cut off. But on the public road, every boy, every passing herd of sheep or cows gives them a lift. John Burroughs wrote that in 1909. There was a time in Montana when weeds weren't a problem. Plants, animals, and insects evolved together over the years, perfectly adapted to the soils and climate. Natural forces like floods, fire, and volcanoes shaped the land. Some native plants, like this orchid, were never very numerous. Other plants, like the native bunch grasses, provided food for the huge herds of buffalo that once roamed Montana. If there was drought in one area, animals moved to another, and the remaining plants were able to survive until the rains returned. If herds were too large and sickly, wolves and grizzly bears grew fat. Then circumstances would tilt the other way, and the predators would fall on hard times. We're just beginning to learn all the ways these native plants, animals, and insects lived in balance with each other and the land, and how necessary that balance is. When the first humans came to Montana, more than 10,000 years ago, not much changed. These early Montanans, the ancestors of our Native Americans, also lived in balance with nature. They learned to work with nature and turn it to their advantage whenever possible. When they saw how lightning fires renewed the grasses, they set prairie fires themselves. They learned where and when nature was especially bountiful, and if hunting was poor, they moved on. When white men came to Montana, much changed. The herds of buffalo dwindled while herds of cattle and sheep grew. The sod was broken for farms, and miners dug into the earth. Whole forests were cut for mine timbers, houses, and fuel. In a relatively short period of time, little more than 100 years, ecosystems which had developed over thousands of years were changed forever. Immigrants brought the familiar plants and animals they had known in Europe with them to the United States. Sometimes hitchhikers traveled with the seed for crops, in fodder for the animals, or in the dirt that was used as ballast for ships. These hitchhikers were the seeds of plants that were native in Europe, where they had evolved over many years, and where they had plenty of natural enemies to keep their numbers in check. In Montana, some of those plants became problems. They no longer had the insects and plant diseases that had kept them in balance in their native land. Any plant that grows where you don't want it is called a weed. But all weeds are not equally bad. Some are basically just a nuisance. Other weeds can reduce the productivity of the land by crowding out desirable plants, sometimes reducing the productivity up to 90% or more. Federal law defines noxious weeds as plants of foreign origin that can directly or indirectly injure agriculture, navigation, fish, wildlife, or public health. and requires that they be controlled. Right now, there are 15 plants designated as noxious weeds in Montana. Two of the worst are spotted knapweed and leafy spurge. These weeds came from Eastern Europe, where climate and conditions were similar to Montana. Weeds, like other plants, have certain places. Scientists call them habitat types, where the soil, moisture, and temperature is right for them to grow. One of the reasons spotted knapweed is such a problem is that it has a wide range of suitable habitat, and it spreads very quickly. Jerry Marks is a Missoula County Extension agent.
Spotted knapweed was first identified in Montana from a sample that was sent to the Montana State University Herbarium from a site in Ravalli County. That was in 1927. It has since spread throughout all western Montana as well as throughout all the other counties in Montana.
Scientists estimate that more than 37 million acres of land in Montana, about 40% of the state, is vulnerable to knapweed infestation. Native grasses like blue bunch wheatgrass and rough fescue hold the soil and help keep it from eroding. In Montana, much of our soil is relatively thin. Knapweed is less able to hold it in place, and it's lost to erosion, decreasing fertility and increasing the silt in our streams. People also worry that weeds will eventually push some of our rare native plants to extinction before we're able to investigate any properties they may have for, say, combating disease, like cancer or AIDS. Most of the world's drugs have been developed from plants, and each species that disappears is another possible cure we'll never find. Where the ground is disturbed, perhaps from overgrazing or breaking the sod for crops or construction, or even by animals, knapweed can get a foothold and will soon crowd out other plants, creating a monoculture. Frank Kirsten is a range conservationist for the Soil Conservation Service.
Oh, monoculture basically is just a single plant dominating the area. Best example I know of is like a farmer seeding a field of wheat. That's exactly what he's doing, is seeding a monoculture, as near 100% as you can get to that single plant out there.
The way plants grow and reproduce is an important factor in their ability to spread. Some weeds are annuals, meaning they complete their entire growth cycle in 1 year. Other plants, biennials, need 2 years to grow and send up a seed stalk. Short-lived perennials, like spotted knapweed, live from 3 to 5 years, while other perennials keep on year after year. All of them can become problems.
For example, spotted knapweed is a tap-rooted plant. Spreads only by seeds. It blooms, has a rosette around it at the base of the plant in the spring, sends up a seed stalk and blooms, starts blooming in July, full bloom in the first part of August, and then it produces the seeds. And they'll produce up to 1,000 seeds per plant. And it spreads only by seeds.
Although the seeds seldom fall very far from the plant, they can be transported great distances.
We consider it what we call a vehicle spreading plant. People are driving off into the weed where the knapweed is growing, and the seeds will collect on the car, on the bumper, on the undercarriage, and then the vehicles go down the road. We travel long distance in Montana, go to other states, and we carry this seed along with us. And we carry it to sites where knapweed doesn't exist and then get started again.
For many years, people thought knapweed contained an allelopathic chemical that inhibited the growth of other plants.
Because I can remember a few years back we were talking about allelopathic effects of spotted knapweed when it got to be dense. That there was a chemical in the plant that when the plant began to decay, why, it released that toxic material and prevented other plants from growing. And now I think they're beginning to believe that it is not that that's reducing the other plants, it's simply the competition.
Spotted knapweed does contain a chemical that has a strong biological activity. The chemical, called nisin, is concentrated in knapweed leaves. Scientists now think it merely discourages some animals and insects from eating the leaves, and probably doesn't keep other plants from growing. But spotted knapweed is such a strong competitor that it easily takes over, especially if the native grasses have been disturbed, perhaps by road construction. Mike Chandler has been hunting in Montana for over 20 years.
There are some pretty good examples of what's happening, and I think anyone that watches road construction on winter game range areas realizes that I don't think anyone can find a road that was put in the last 15 years where it hasn't introduced knapweed.
Native plant enthusiast Alice Austin points out,
the beekeepers like knapweed, of course, but that's not a good reason for letting anything that takes over in the amount that this does, and the enormous dimensions of the way it spreads and takes over land and destroys it for other uses.
Rancher Bob Schrader says although cows will eat knapweed, they don't do as well on it.
Cows eat knapweed. They do a pretty good job on it, actually. Certain times of year when it's blooming or before it blooms, they do all right on it. They don't gain like they would on grass, though. The production off of it is way short of grass.
He says weeds have cost his ranch a quarter of its production, plus the money they've had to spend on weed control.
This ranch used to run 400 head of cows, and during the 60s, 50s and 60s, and now we're down to about 300 head of cows, so it cost a quarter of the production. Our weed budget runs about $8,000 to $10,000 a year. Most of that's applied aerially. Helicopter time is about $475 an hour. So it adds up pretty quick.
Spotted knapweed seems to be limited by water and shade. If there's more than 70% moisture in the soil, knapweed seeds don't germinate very well.
Well, we had a pasture down here that was solid knapweed when we came, and we could deal with that because we could water it. So we had it plowed and seeded with alfalfa and other seed, and then watered it. And as long as you can do that, you can get rid of your knapweed. But if you can't water it, as you can't in the open countryside, it's pretty difficult to deal with.
Shade seems to limit knapweed's spread. It just doesn't seem to grow as well in the shade. Research indicates that knapweed seeds will survive in the soil for at least 8 years, and probably much longer. The seeds can be spread into new areas by off-road vehicles, on animals' fur or in their droppings, or even on people's clothes. Although spotted knapweed is currently the most widely spread noxious weed in Montana, other weeds, like leafy spurge, have the potential to become even bigger problems. Leafy spurge is the plant that paints hills yellowish green in the spring and summer, turning fiery red-orange in the fall. Some people think leafy spurge is kind of pretty, but they don't realize what a destructive and persistent plant it can be. Jerry Marks.
Like leafy spurge has a deep root system that will go down depending on the depth of soil, but it's been documented up to 20-25 foot deep. And it spreads both vertically as well as horizontally. And on the roots, they have nodes. For example, there's a pink node up here at the crown. And when something happens to the top growth, it sends up new shoots and continues to grow. These buds can be further down on the root system. It also has a flower and produces seeds, so this particular plant spreads not only by seeds, but it also spreads through its root system. And you will see this develop in patches in intensive monocultures through this spreading root system.
The showy, yellowish bracts appear before the inconspicuous green flowers, and each plant produces about 140 seeds. When ripe, the seed head explodes, sending seeds up to 15 feet away. But it's the roots that keep the patch of leafy spurge going. A piece of root only half an inch long can grow a whole new plant. Burning the plant, or mowing it, seems to stimulate the roots to send up new growth. Most cattle won't eat leafy spurge, and they seem to avoid areas where it grows, perhaps overgrazing another area. Leafy spurge plants contain a milky sap that irritates the mouth of cattle and horses and sometimes provokes an allergic reaction in people. Frank Kirsten.
Yes, that's been reported. I believe, very well documented that milky sap, it's a sticky, milky juice, can irritate a lot of people. It's never irritated me. I've had quite a bit of it on my hands through the years when I was pulling it and one thing and another, just looking at the plant. I've never had any reaction to it, but some people do.
Leafy spurge is so competitive that it will take over ground dominated by knapweed, and being a perennial, it will hold on for years. Walter Dodd has lived up Butler Creek for most of his life.
I think back in the 30s, once upon a time, a man came here to clean out his truck after he had been butchering. And he brought some leafy spurge. That was the first weed that I remembered of that I was really concerned about. And as far as that goes, that spot is now dead, but it has moved on and continued on up the hill, and I still have a few plants from that original seeding. At least I think they are.
Although leafy spurge is not yet infested as big an area as spotted knapweed, it may be a much bigger threat, especially for cattle ranchers. Leafy spurge tolerates water and shade much better than knapweed and has the potential to spread and take over even more land in Montana. Leafy spurge seeds are often spread by birds, by wildlife, and by water. Once established, leafy spurge is nearly impossible to get rid of, even with herbicides. Herbicides, chemicals that disrupt the growing processes of plants, will kill that top growth, but as Jerry Marks says, they don't always seem to get into the roots.
Ideally, the herbicide is taken into the plant and spreads down into the root system and will kill that root system. In some cases, like we've seen with leafy spurge, there is some herbicides that are active, but it doesn't completely translocate throughout the root system. It may only go down there a little ways, and an axis acts like kind of burning off that plant, and then the plant will start up from those nodes that are on the roots and reestablish themselves. We often think we have got a good control of it the year we apply herbicides, and then we see shoots coming up, and within a year or two the infestation is the same as it was before.
Herbicides can help control leafy spurge, especially when the plants are young. But you'll need to apply both patience and persistence along with the chemical. Herbicides are much more effective in controlling knapweed.
Knapweed, on the other hand, is a plant that's very susceptible to herbicides, and we see much more effectiveness in controlling knapweed with herbicides because it takes in the herbicide, translocates the root, and it doesn't have as deep penetrating root system. It has a tap root, and herbicides are much more effective in controlling that plant than it is with leafy spurge.
But because knapweed has infested so many acres, the cost of applying herbicides can be very high. And some people object to the use of them. Researchers who have studied the health risks of herbicides say that if used as directed, they are much less of a health hazard than smoking cigarettes, for instance. Of course, some people may be highly sensitive to the chemicals in herbicides, and they should take care to avoid them. And it's important to learn how herbicides interact with various soils, water, and other plants before you use them. Read and follow the directions, and use caution if you're mixing and applying them. Some herbicides are restricted, meaning people who want to use them must study or take a class and then pass a test in order to become certified applicators. And every few years they have to take another class or pass another test. Herbicides eventually biodegrade, and some of them become harmless in the soil in only a few weeks. Because the seeds of knapweed and spurge remain viable in the soil for many years, herbicide applications must usually be repeated.
I started in with the old chemicals like atlaside and borax and things like that, and then 2,4-D came along, and now I have the Toradon and Roundup and things like that, so it's much easier now to control the weeds. But it's something that you never finish. You must continue at all times.
Though spraying is expensive, it can work well, especially when combined with other methods.
The current thinking on managing weeds is using a number of the tools and implementing them where possible, more of what we call an integrated pest management approach, finding the tools that will fit the various sites and using more than one tool.
The tools of integrated pest management are cultural control, biological control, and chemical control. Cultural control includes cultivating, mowing, and burning the weeds. Though these methods can reduce the amount of top growth and prevent the formation of new seeds, they won't get rid of the weeds. Esther McDonald is a rancher near Phillipsburg, and she says weed control is part of their ranch budget.
We feel now that it is a management tool, just like vaccinating our cows or putting fertilizer on, that we have to budget every year for some chemical weed control as well as some manual weed control, either through cultivation, increased irrigation, or just plain old pulling the weeds where we don't want them.
Biological control refers to controlling weeds with insects, plant diseases, or animals, often the same biological agents that kept the weeds under control in their native land.
In recent years, there's been a lot of work done on biological weed control. And that is a process of going back to where these plants originate, find out what infests them, and keep them in check over there. A lot of work has been concentrated on spotted knapweed. They have identified 18 insects. A number of diseases worldwide will infest this particular plant. It is a perennial plant, and the insects have to feed on all the leaves, the flowers, and the roots to halt the spread of them, and it takes a number of insects.
The insects that lay their eggs in knapweed seed heads can reduce knapweed seed production up to 95%. But the remaining seeds are enough to spread the weed. Scientists estimate that it will take 6 to 8 different kinds of insects, each attacking the same weed species, to actually control that weed. Research has been done to make sure these insects don't also attack beneficial species. Otherwise, biological control could backfire. If scientists found out too late that some bug preferred, say, ponderosa pine to knapweed. Work is also being done on a disease that attacks knapweed.
Most of the work that has been done is a fungus disease that infects the root, called sclerotinia. The research work that's being done is figuring out how to alter that fungus to control the cycle, make it as host-specific as possible, so itself does not become a problem in the environment and attack beneficial crops.
Animals that will eat weeds are also part of biological control. Some animals, like goats and sheep, will eat leafy spurge as well as knapweed. People who raise sheep say they gain more weight faster on spurge than they would on grass. Raising sheep seems to be one of the best ways to use ground that's covered with leafy spurge. The sheep control it in the pasture, and herbicides can be used around the fence lines to help keep it from spreading. But sometimes it's kind of hard to convince a cattleman to switch to sheep. Goats like just about all weeds, even preferring them to grass. Dinah Geisel has been living on Lavelle Creek for 17 years, and for most of that time she's been raising goats. She says the key factor in controlling weeds is keeping the goats confined.
When goats are confined to a small area, for example, 8 goats to 2 acres, they will keep the weeds under control to the extent that you'll have practically like a golf course. It's green and grass because they prefer the weeds. They don't want to eat grass, so that's what you're left with. If you don't confine them, they pick and choose. They're called browsers, like deer. They're not grazers. And they'll eat what they want. And in that case, you have a mix of different kinds of plants. They don't eat anything to the ground unless they're confined and absolutely have to. When that happens, you'll get rid of almost all weeds, and they'll leave the grass. They can't be expected to eat mature dry weeds in the late summer. They don't like it. It isn't palatable to them. But if they're put in the spring, they will control them as long as they're confined in a fairly small area.
Prevention. Keeping weeds out of new areas. Now that's much better and far cheaper than trying to control them once they get established.
Certainly, if you're in areas to where spotted knapweed is, you need to check your vehicles regularly, wash them off, sweep them off, look to see if you've got knapweed plants on the undercarriage, take them off and dispose of them. Just go through a routine process. Same thing in construction equipment if it's working out in areas where there's noxious weeds, is to wash them off before they go to another construction site.
But the first step in prevention is knowing what the weeds are, as Esther McDonald points out.
A lot of people don't even know what it is. They just think it's a pretty purple flower. And I think the same thing. A lot of people probably think spurge is yellow, and so they just think it's a wildflower, you know, rather than a toxic type plant or a noxious weed. So they have to learn to identify what it is, and then they have to I think they can start looking around their lots, whether they're in rural Missoula or rural Phelpsburg or maybe on a farm, and if they see it, maybe they're not interested in spraying for it, depending on what the area is, but they can pull them.
If you see different plants or kinds of plants that are coming up that you do not recognize, get them identified. Take them to the Extension Office or Soil Conservation Service and get them identified to make sure that you may not, or you may have a problem plant, and again, you may not, but you need to check that out.
There's also a program in Montana that certifies hay as being free of noxious weed seed. It is especially recommended for pack animals in back country or wilderness areas. Wilderness areas are supposed to be free of human influence, but weeds are a sure sign that people have been there.
I took a trip up into Bob Marshall this year and rode through Bob Marshall and all the way down all the trails. There was knapweed along the way, and that's kind of discouraging to see that.
There's also a growing concern that weeds could alter these fragile native ecosystems in ways that we don't understand, upsetting the balance of nature in unpredictable ways. Preventing the spread of weeds and considering the use of all the control methods or tools is more than integrated pest management. It's good management. Walter Dodd thinks so.
There is not much point in owning the ground if you can't use it, if the weeds have taken it over. So if I want to, partly it's pride and partly it's a matter of getting a crop off of them.
But controlling weeds, in many cases, is a matter of money. Mike Chandler used to sell ranch properties.
A person goes out and buys one of the many 20-acre parcels that is covered with knapweed, and if he wants to make that productive, he's going to have to spend more money almost on an annual basis just to get rid of the weed problem than what he's paying in taxes. We all worry about our taxes, and in reality, this weed problem is much greater financial burden than the tax we pay. So taken as a whole, we're talking millions and millions of dollars in lost property values. Then the other side of the coin being the wildlife habitat and sportsmen's dollars that can potentially be lost just adds to the whole problem.
And sometimes the cost of fighting weeds is not only more than the property tax, it's more than the land is worth, at least in dollars. That's where stewardship of the land ethic, comes in. Most Montanans realize their connection to the land, the feeling they get when they look out over the rangelands and forests, valleys and mountaintops, and they know in their hearts and bones that caring for the land is right, and they know when something is wrong.
Just on this ranch, you know, the whole landscape is, you know, it seems to be blighted to me by knapweed. It's such a dirty weed. You can see it along the roads, and it's dark and stocky all winter long. And in the spring, you know, when it usually used to be that it all gets green with grass and everything, here's these old stalks of knapweed sticking up there, and it just, you know, it really is a disgusting sight.
We really are stewards of the land. Whether it's a land we live on or the state and national forests we all own, and we have a responsibility to protect the land that goes beyond money, because it's the land our existence rides on. It's love for the land that justifies our concern for weeds, and love for the land which impels us to control it.